There are moments in history when a nation stops, looks at itself, and chooses a different path. What is unfolding today in Burkina Faso is one of those moments, a quiet revolution happening not in the halls of government, but on the very streets where ordinary citizens walk every morning. And even though the world's major media networks may ignore it or distort it, you and I are here to face it directly, without fear and without filters. Because what you are about to witness is not just a campaign against street begging, it is the declaration of a new national mindset, one built on dignity, responsibility, and a refusal to let future generations inherit the same cycles of poverty and exploitation as before. Across Africa, this story is stirring intense debate. Is this discipline or oppression? Is this reform or a warning to the world? And most importantly, is this the beginning of Africa standing firmly on its own feet? Please hit like and join us as we explore this story together. To understand what is happening on the streets of Burkina Faso today, we must begin with a force that did not previously exist, a civic institution known as Brigade Labal. Established in September 2025, this organization was created with a simple but firm mission: to restore public order, uphold discipline, and bring dignity back to the spaces where communities gather, work, and raise their children. Brigade Labal is not a military force, nor is it a police unit. It is a citizen-driven organization designed to intervene in areas where society has been neglected for far too long. Illegal street activities, the decline of public hygiene, the exploitation of children, and the growing culture of individuals refusing to work despite being fully capable. Their work is linked to another national initiative known as fictional, a volunteer movement encouraging the country to build with its own hands instead of depending on foreign creditors or international institutions for every brick and every bag of cement. The campaign that drew public attention began when Brigade Labal confronted groups of street beggars across the capital, many of whom were not weak, not sick, and not disabled, but healthy adults pretending to suffer in order to earn easy money. Some arrived with children under 6 years old to evoke sympathy. Others hid money in secret pockets, and some even carried knives to protect the earnings they claimed they did not have. What appeared to be poverty on the surface was, in many cases, manipulation and exploitation. The officers followed a strict procedure. They questioned each person. Are you employed? Have you applied for work? Do you have any physical disability? Why are you using a young child for begging? When no reasonable answer was given, the officers did not raise their voices. They raised the law. Burkina Faso's legal code is very clear. Anyone capable of working but choosing to beg can face 2 to 6 months in prison. Anyone faking an injury or disability can face up to 1 year. Anyone using a child under 6 years old for begging can face penalties of up to 3 years in prison, along with heavy fines. And those exploiting a disabled person for financial gain can face the maximum sentence. However, instead of filling prisons, Brigade Labal chose another path: restitution through public labor. Offenders were taken to work sites, cleaning streets, collecting waste, supporting construction projects. They contributed to the nation in the very places where they had committed their violations. It was a decisive moment, one that earned admiration from some citizens and discomfort from others. But no matter how powerful it seemed, this first phase was only the surface of a much deeper national transformation. As the vans carrying the detained individuals moved toward the work sites, word spread quickly through the community. Citizens followed on foot. Shopkeepers came out from behind their counters. Elderly men leaned on their canes. Mothers whispered to their daughters. For years, many had watched young children tug at their clothes for money, or seen healthy adults feigning disability, yet they had felt powerless to confront it. Now, for the first time, the law was not an abstract concept written in a distant office. It was alive, visible, and operating in broad daylight. At the construction zone, the mood was surprisingly calm. Brigade Labal officers distributed gloves, brooms, and reflective vests. Those who had been begging just hours earlier were now sweeping debris, carrying stones, and leveling sidewalks. The transformation was jarring but undeniable. Individuals who had once portrayed themselves as helpless were now visibly strong, coordinated, and able-bodied. The pretense had fallen away, replaced by an unexpected display of capability. Local onlookers reacted with a mixture of astonishment and relief. Some applauded softly, Others nodded in agreement, saying, "At least now they are contributing." A few expressed discomfort, unsure whether this approach felt too harsh or too public. Yet one sentiment appeared repeatedly among older residents. Our streets are not places for deception. Our children deserve better role models. Internationally, however, the tone was different. Advocacy groups outside the country raised concerns about forced labor and public humiliation. Analysts on foreign networks speculated that this campaign reflected authoritarian tendencies. Even before the official coverage began, there were predictions that the narrative would focus on punishment rather than reform, on optics rather than context. And this is where the emotional core of the story deepens, because for the citizens who witnessed these events firsthand, this was not oppression, it was accountability. It was a reclaiming of public spaces, a refusal to allow vulnerable children to be used as bargaining chips, and a collective insistence that strength must not be wasted on manipulation. In that moment, Burkina Faso became a nation, wrestling openly with a question every society eventually faces. What happens when discipline collides with compassion and when justice demands more than simple punishment? The answer to that question, shaped by thousands of voices, conflicted emotions, and a rapidly changing political landscape, would define the next stage of this unfolding national transformation. The immediate aftermath of the Brigade Labal campaign rippled far beyond the street corners where the operation began. In the days that followed, families talked about it at dinner tables, neighborhoods discussed it during evening gatherings, and community leaders debated its implications at local meetings. What occurred was not simply the removal of beggars from public spaces, it was a deeper societal awakening, a reflection on what values a nation chooses to uphold. For many citizens, especially older generations, who remember a time when discipline and duty were cultural pillars, the campaign brought a sense of restored order. Streets that once felt chaotic or unpredictable suddenly appeared calmer. Children were no longer seen clinging to strangers for spare coins. Offices and marketplaces functioned without the usual interruptions of aggressive begging. In subtle ways, the very rhythm of daily life shifted. But the greatest societal impact came from what the campaign revealed. A significant number of able-bodied individuals were avoiding productive work, while the nation struggled with labor shortages in essential sectors such as agriculture, sanitation, and construction. This mismatch, visible to everyone once exposed, triggered an important national conversation. Parents began urging their sons to seek apprenticeships. Young men who had once hovered around street corners started asking about training programs. Even religious leaders took to their pulpits to remind congregations that dignity is rooted not in appearances, but in contribution. The realization spread that a country cannot rise if thousands of its strongest people choose deception over effort. Yet the campaign also raised genuine concerns among rights advocates within the nation. Some questioned whether public labor as a corrective measure could be misused by future administrations. Others argued that poverty itself, not individual choices, must be addressed more aggressively. Those voices added nuance to the discussion, highlighting the need for clearer guidelines and stronger social protections. Still, one thing was undeniable. Burkina Faso had entered a new era of public accountability. The social contract was shifting away from permissiveness and toward a model centered on responsibility. And that shift, as powerful as it was on the streets, would soon echo into the political arena, reshaping public trust, redefining national leadership, and challenging the very narrative the world holds about this rising African nation. As the social impact of the Brigade Labal campaign unfolded, its political dimension became impossible to ignore. What began as a street-level intervention quickly transformed into a referendum on national leadership, direction, and identity. For the first time in many years, citizens found themselves engaging in public debate, not out of fear or frustration, but out of a renewed sense of ownership over their country's destiny. Across town halls and radio call-in programs, ordinary citizens voiced something rare: confidence. Confidence that their government could implement real change. Confidence that laws could be enforced fairly. Confidence that national discipline was not a relic of the past, but a path toward a more self-reliant future. In a region where countless reform efforts have been abandoned, diluted, or manipulated, this rising confidence held remarkable political weight. At the same time, the campaign exposed the political risks inherent in any bold reform. Critics argued that such measures could be weaponized by future administrations, turning public labor into a punitive tool rather than a rehabilitative one. They warned that without clear oversight, even reformist policies could slip into authoritarian patterns. These cautionary voices did not reject the principle of accountability. Rather, they sought assurances that the dignity of every citizen would remain protected. Yet it was precisely this national conversation, this clash of ideals, hopes, and fears, that signaled a political awakening. Burkina Faso was not simply enforcing discipline, it was rediscovering the meaning of civic responsibility. Citizens were no longer passive observers but active participants in defining the moral boundaries of their society. Political analysts noted a significant shift. Public trust in national institutions was growing, not blindly, not unconditionally, but cautiously rooted in visible action. The government was no longer perceived as distant or ceremonial. It was acting, correcting, intervening, and most importantly, forcing the country to confront its own contradictions. This new social compact raised deeper questions. What kind of future does Burkina Faso envision for itself? Can discipline become a catalyst for genuine development rather than mere control? And how will this emerging sense of order influence regional dynamics in West Africa? The political landscape was changing, and the rest of the world was beginning to take notice. But as global observers turned their gaze toward Burkina Faso, their interpretations would differ dramatically from the sentiments felt within the nation itself. From the perspective of the United States, what unfolded in Burkina Faso was not simply a domestic policy, it was a case study in how rising African nations are redefining governance on their own terms. American analysts, especially those accustomed to evaluating foreign reforms through a Western legal and cultural framework, were divided in their interpretations. On one side were commentators who saw Brigade Labal's campaign as a reaffirmation of law and order. They argued that every sovereign state has the right and the responsibility to regulate public space, protect children from exploitation, and correct behaviors that undermine national cohesion. These voices, often from older generations who lived through America's own eras of civic reform, viewed the initiative with a sense of historical familiarity. Societies succeed when accountability is not optional. But younger analysts and rights-focused institutions carried a different tone. They raised concerns about coerced labor, public shaming, and the possibility of expanding state power beyond reasonable limits. Their critique reflected a broader American debate about the balance between civil liberties and public order, a debate that resonates deeply in the United States, especially among citizens skeptical of expanding government authority. This divide in interpretation highlighted an important truth. Americans often view African political developments through frameworks shaped by their own domestic history, rather than by the lived realities of African societies. The economic pressures, cultural expectations, and social contracts of Burkina Faso differ profoundly from those of the United States. Yet the instinct to interpret African actions through American sensitivities persisted, leading some viewers to misread the purpose and spirit behind the campaign. Still, even within the United States, there was a growing chorus willing to acknowledge that Africa's reform movements should not be measured solely against Western standards. These observers pointed out that the United States itself uses community service as an alternative to incarceration, and that restorative justice has become a widely accepted model. If anything, they argued, Burkina Faso was applying such principles to a context where informal street economies had grown damagingly unchecked. This emerging perspective opened the door to a more nuanced understanding, one that recognized Burkina Faso's struggle not as an echo of Western history, but as a uniquely African attempt to reclaim dignity, order, and national purpose. Yet America was not the only nation watching. Across Europe, Asia, and the African continent itself, reactions were forming, each shaped by its own political interests and cultural assumptions. Beyond the United States, the global reaction to Burkina Faso's actions revealed an even more complex mosaic of opinions. In Europe, analysts tended to approach the campaign through the lens of humanitarian standards. Reports emphasized potential risks of coercion, questioning whether the line between rehabilitation and punishment was clearly defined. Some human rights organizations issued early statements of concern, warning that African nations must ensure reforms do not erode individual liberties. These responses were predictable. shaped by Europe's long-standing inclination to act as moral arbiter in global affairs, even when the full local context is not fully understood. In contrast, several Asian nations viewed the development with a level of pragmatic respect. Countries like China, Singapore, and even South Korea, each with histories of blending strict public order measures with rapid national development, interpreted Burkina Faso's approach as a sign of emerging discipline. Their commentary highlighted the correlation between orderly public spaces and economic progress, suggesting that such reforms could lay the groundwork for future stability. But the most consequential reactions came from within Africa itself. Regional leaders, civil society groups, and ordinary citizens across West Africa watched closely, recognizing that Burkina Faso's actions were not merely administrative, they were symbolic. In a continent grappling with youth unemployment, urban overcrowding, and complex informal economies, the idea of turning public disorder into constructive national labor struck a powerful chord. Some praised the initiative as a courageous rejection of dependency narratives. Others cautioned that sustainable reform requires opportunities, not just enforcement. Across Africa news networks, commentators posed difficult questions. Should other nations adopt similar civic models? Can discipline coexist with compassion in societies healing from decades of colonial and post-colonial turmoil? And what responsibilities do African governments hold toward citizens who are capable of work but choose avoidance over contribution? These debates underscored a fundamental shift occurring within the continent. Africa is beginning to debate its internal affairs on its own terms, not merely reacting to Western interpretations. Burkina Faso, intentionally or not, had ignited a conversation about sovereignty, dignity, and the moral boundaries of nation-building. And as this regional discourse deepened, one figure's name began to circulate repeatedly, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with scrutiny, but always with significance. His leadership style, his rhetoric, and his uncompromising insistence on national responsibility were becoming inseparable from the events unfolding on the ground. That figure, of course, was President Ibrahim Traoré. What came next would shift this story from a policy debate into a broader narrative about African self-determination. The true twist in this story emerges not from the streets, not from the work sites, and not even from the heated debates unfolding across Africa and the Western world. It comes from something quieter, something far more consequential. As international critics framed the Brigade Labal campaign as controversial, and as ordinary citizens continued to interpret it through their own lived experience, a new realization began forming beneath the surface. What Burkina Faso had done was not simply enforce order, it had revealed a blueprint for how a nation, long shaped by external narratives and foreign expectations, could reclaim control over its own identity. A blueprint for how discipline could be tied not to punishment, but to purpose. And a blueprint for how a government could confront social decay without surrendering its dignity to global judgment. The twist was this: the world thought it was witnessing a crackdown, but in reality, it was witnessing the birth of an ideology, one that connected public responsibility with national pride. An ideology that challenged the assumption that African states must constantly seek permission or validation from the outside. An ideology grounded in the belief that strength is not authoritarian when it is used to restore dignity. And at the center of this ideological shift, whether intentionally or not, stood one man, President Ibrahim Traoré. His presence was not explicit in the street operations, but the spirit of the reforms, the assertiveness, and the unapologetic push for national self-reliance all carried his unmistakable imprint. This realization would soon reshape the entire narrative of the Brigade Labal campaign, turning it from a local event into a continental symbol. As the dust settled, it became increasingly clear that the Brigade Labal campaign was never just an isolated enforcement action. It was a window into the deeper transformation underway within Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré. His emergence as a symbol of uncompromising national responsibility elevated the entire episode beyond the boundaries of policing or public hygiene. What unfolded on those streets was, in truth, a reflection of the broader doctrine he has championed across Africa: news outlets, a doctrine of sovereignty, dignity, and unapologetic self-determination. The twist sharpened as observers realized something else. The world's reaction to Burkina Faso said more about global power dynamics than about the campaign itself. Nations accustomed to defining what acceptable governance looks like struggled to process a model that did not originate in Washington, Brussels, or Paris. Analysts who once dismissed the country as unstable now found themselves forced to study its new trajectory. And African youth, hungry for leaders who reflect their aspirations, not their limitations, saw in Traoré a leader who dared to break the script written for them. Instead of weakening his standing, the criticism strengthened it. Instead of isolating the nation, it drew new allies who respected its willingness to carve its own path. And instead of discouraging reform, the controversy ignited renewed interest in expanding similar civic initiatives across the region. By the time the global conversation reached full intensity, the twist had completed its arc. Burkina Faso was no longer being examined as a struggling state, it was being studied as a prototype of African resilience. And Ibrahim Traoré, once underestimated, now stood as a central figure in a narrative far larger than one campaign. The reawakening of African identity itself. What remained was to understand what this transformation means for the future and what responsibilities now fall on the shoulders of the people who believe in this rising vision. In the end, what happened on the streets of Burkina Faso was more than the enforcement of a public order campaign. It was the beginning of a cultural rebirth, one built not on foreign prescriptions or borrowed ideals, but on a renewed belief that a nation can rise when its people choose responsibility over resignation, dignity over deception, and courage over convenience. For the elderly watching from their doorsteps, for the youth searching for direction, and for every African who has ever wondered whether change is still possible, this moment carries a simple but powerful message. Transformation does not begin in parliaments or foreign embassies. It begins with ordinary citizens deciding that their future is worth fighting for. President Ibrahim Traoré expressed this truth in the words that have echoed across African news networks and captured the hopes of millions. We do not ask permission to be free. We stand up and take it. So I leave you with this question. Do you believe these reforms are the first steps toward a new future? Or should Africa still wait for someone else to lead the way? If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to your heart, share this story. If you believe Burkina Faso is writing a new chapter of sovereignty, subscribe to this channel because truth matters more than headlines. May God bless Africa, and may its people never bow again